This lecture series is about iconoclasm, a term that we will define just momentarily. And it is undertaken in conjunction with an exhibition which is up in our Mason Gallery right now called Striking Power, Iconoclasm in Ancient Egypt. It's a show of about 45 sculptures from the Brooklyn Museum of Art in Brooklyn, New York. That is the same institution from which we borrowed those Impressionist paintings and sculptures for French moderns. No, it is not the beginning of a long-term affiliation with the Brooklyn Museum. It is just coincidence, but we are very fortunate to have had both shows. This one in particular, because the Brooklyn Museum is well known, not just nationally, but internationally for the quality of its ancient Egyptian collection. And this is a show which began, as some of you may have read or heard, from visitor questions. Right? Visitors would ask through various media, why is it that Egyptian sculptures so frequently don't have noses? And this causes the curator to actually do some research and to put together a show on iconoclasm, on image destruction in ancient Egypt. Now, the purpose of this lecture series, and this lecture in particular, of course, engages very directly with that subject matter. But the next lecture series in 2 weeks looks at iconoclasm, image destruction, in the Byzantine Empire, which, as we'll discuss in 2 weeks, is a total modern fabrication. The Byzantine Empire never existed. If you went to Constantinople and asked someone if they were Byzantine, they'd look at you like you're crazy. They thought of themselves as Romans, right up until 1453. Their term for themselves was Romanitas, Romans. But we'll talk about Byzantine iconoclasm, notably in the 8th century AD. Then we'll talk about Reformation iconoclasm. Several weeks later, we'll talk about secular iconoclasm with a specific focus on political iconoclasm from the French Revolution through, we could go all the way up to the 21st century, although we'll probably spend a little bit more time in post-Soviet Russia than we will in the 21st century. And then we'll finish with a broad design charrette, a conversation around different design strategies that we might employ to think about manifestations of memory and power in Jacksonville. So this lecture will start with Egyptian iconoclasm. It'll go straight through. We'll talk about Egyptian art. And then on the very last slide, I'm going to encourage you to take some of the lessons that we'll learn tonight and apply them to shared space and the monuments in Jacksonville. There is no politics involved in this from the museum's perspective to the extent that we don't have a view. I don't have a view, right? I, Adam Levine, may have a view. Anyone in this audience should have a view. But my job here, and our job as a museum, is in a nonpartisan way to promote civil discourse, which is something that is sorely missing at this moment in our history. That's not necessarily different than other moments in our history, incidentally, but it takes knowing history to know that. So what we're going to do for this lecture series is we're going to learn a little bit about history, and we're going to come to realize that we are not the first society in the world that has wondered what to do with sculptures that not everyone likes equally. That is not a 21st century American problem. That is a human problem. Actually, it's a problem that emerges once humans settle into cities and states, but let's call it a human problem for the last 5,000 years. And among the earliest instances of this relationship with previous sculptures of people that not everyone likes equally well occurs in Egypt. So we're talking about Egypt today. We'll relate it to 21st century Jacksonville, and then we will march on through history, focusing admittedly only on Western examples, but march on through history and learn the lessons of that history and how each of them apply to us today to allow us at the end of it to have a civil conversation about how we might engage some of these historical lessons. Sound like a plan? Great. Let's get started. So I will refer back to this original slide in a subsequent slide, and you'll see me fly back and forth. But just so everyone knows what they're looking at, and this is a sculpture which is in the exhibition. You are looking at a sculpture of Hatshepsut, who is a pharaoh, who is also a woman, and who is probably, well, certainly the first female pharaoh, but probably the first female ruler, right, in human history. Remember, history is recorded. Doesn't mean that there weren't rulers elsewhere. So it's a New Kingdom sculpture, and it is ritually destroyed largely focused on destroying her regal paraphernalia, right? So we're going to talk about this and what that means. But if you look at the way it's destroyed, there are 3 or 4 places of primary destruction. And I'm going into some detail here because I want to condition you to how to look at these sculptures to look for intentional destruction. Where you see very sharp breaks, right? That is from trauma, right? It could be that the sculpture fell over, right? But it's not sort of a gradual wear and tear. You see soft edges when you see things eroded over time, right? Or where you see something which has been broken and softened by the passage of time, whether it's erosion from friction or erosion from water. Not a lot of water in Egypt, as some of you may know, outside of the Nile. So you can see that there's a breakage down here, which is kind of funny for a woman. But pharaohs, right, particularly in this period, but starting much earlier, would wear ceremonial beards. So this was actually a symbol of Hatshepsut's power, and it was removed. You see that there's breakage up here in the headdress, which is called the Nemes headdress, which was, again, a symbol of pharaonic power. And also, right up here, where for those of you who are doctors, you're familiar with the idea of the uraeus, but the idea that serpents, or in this case, a cobra, can ward off evil. So there was an explicit attempt made to destroy this apotropaic, this symbol which existed to ward off evil. Right, so all of Hatshepsut's pharaonic regalia is stripped away, and therefore her power is stripped away. Why this happened is something we'll discuss, and about that nose, you'll hear a lot more. But where you're looking for sharp breaks, right, and those are usually indicative of marks that are made by hand or by a fall. But as you can imagine, when a sculpture falls, it falls on a single point. So where you see distributed sharp breaks, it is a good indication that an individual destroyed the statue intentionally. Okay? So let's start from the very beginning. What do we mean by iconoclasm? Well, I already told you it means image breaking, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. I was joking with one of my colleagues earlier. This is very sophisticated. You get a PhD for doing this. Iconoclasm is icon plus clasm. So these are Greek words, or words with Greek origin. So clasm means breaking or destruction. Icon is a little bit more complicated. So you click on icons on your desktop now. Right? If you are Eastern Orthodox, you pray to icons. We'll talk about that tradition in the next lecture. So what is an icon? An icon has obviously become inflated, particularly in our digital age. What does it mean to be an image? And in Greek, which I can't speak, but I can read a little bit, the idea of an icon is more complicated than just image. There's actually this wonderful new study that shows one of the ways that you can become happier is to learn the terms for happiness in other languages. That in Zulu, right, there are different words that mean different types of happiness. There's a happiness that comes from sitting and contemplating, and there's a happiness that comes from eating a good meal. Those are very different types of happiness. And if you understand that linguistic variety, you actually have a richer, more textured meaning of happiness. So we try and translate words from one language to another, and they're imperfect. So icon is sort of an image, but it means something more like likeness. It means more like something that captures the physical essence of a thing. So there is sort of a more spiritual component to it. And for those of you who do know anything about any sort of biblical scholarship, doesn't matter the language, whether it's Latin, belus, whether it's Greek, kalos, whether it's Hebrew, tov, the idea of beauty has both inward and outward components, right? So the idea of an icon, right, it is an image, but it's actually something more like similarity or similitude or likeness. But we nonetheless use it to mean image because it also meant that. Right? There's a depth to the meaning of this word. Some of you may be familiar with this image, which circulated, I think, in 2013. This is an image of ISIS, right, the Islamic State, having infiltrated in Iraq, the second largest museum in Iraq, in Mosul, and destroying images And this made headlines as that institution was largely ransacked and destroyed. And it's a reminder that iconoclasm, for religious reasons and otherwise, continues to this very day. That we are talking about something which is as relevant now as it was 5,000 years ago, which is in fact the point of this lecture series. But there's another important point about this particular photo, which is although it sort of lagged 4 days later after the original headline broke, right? Thousands of years of history destroyed at Mosul Museum. A lot of the pictures that were shown, like this one, don't show original objects being destroyed. They show replicas of objects being destroyed. Right. Now, that's a really fascinating thing for you to think about. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the next lecture, not so much in this one. But what does it mean that a copy is imbued with as much significance as the original? What does it mean about how images mean? Where does the power reside? And it's back to this idea of likeness, right? It's not the thing in and of itself. It's not the original object. It was that this image looked like a pagan object. This wasn't an object that was made before Islam. This wasn't an object that was made before the Prophet Muhammad. And this wasn't an object that was ever venerated in any of the ways that would have caused it to be considered idolatrous, per se. But it looked like something that was. It was a copy of something that was. So it goes to show that there's much more nuance to this idea of image and this idea of image and likeness that is inherent in the idea of the icon and iconoclasm. Buckle in, right? This is going to be thorny stuff, right? This is not easy. There's some nuance here. So okay, so now we know what we mean by iconoclasm. We mean image breaking, but obviously there's some nuance we have to tease out of over the course of these lectures of what an image is, right, and how an image gets its power. So what do I mean by ancient Egypt, right? Everyone knows what ancient Egypt is, but how would we actually define ancient Egypt? So we can define it chronologically, and we'll sort of drill more deeply into what we mean by this chronology. These are, broad estimates, right? But basically what we're talking about is 3000 BC, right, which is obviously a little less precise on the front end. And what happens in 3000 BC is that Upper and Lower Egypt are unified. I'll define those terms for you in just a second. And then we run through AD 642, which is the Arab conquest of Egypt. That's actually not quite right. The Arab conquest of Egypt is 639 to, depends on how you calculate it, because then they push out into the rest of Africa. But let's say 645, 646. 642, though, we say pretty precisely because Alexandria falls at the end of 641. So we can drill down a little bit more precisely into what we mean by the fall of Egypt. So the Arab conquest of Egypt, which is in the first caliphate, the Rashidun Caliphate after Muhammad's death, extends into northern Africa. And all the time in between is what we refer to as ancient Egypt. So we can also define ancient Egypt geographically, namely around this idea of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. So here you have an image of Lower Egypt. Now it's wonderful to be in Jacksonville having this conversation because we have a river that flows south to north. I don't have to describe to you the difference between upriver and downriver and how confusing that is. Right, so Lower Egypt is further north because it is further down the Nile, right? And Upper Egypt is further south because it is further up the Nile. And the Nile is a very confusing thing. If you know anything about the Nile, there are actually two Niles that are tributaries of the Nile. There's the Blue Nile and the White Nile. It's all very complicated. But what you can see here is Lower Egypt, and that's really where most of the runes and most of the artifacts that we consider associated with ancient Egypt come from, mostly from Memphis south, although you can see that we'll talk about some of these sites, particularly Tel El Amarna, or Amarna, which was the capital of sort of a rogue religious sect, which you'll see some artifacts related to in just a few slides. The other thing you see here, which is incredibly important, is you see this area in green. So I mentioned that there's not a lot of water, which is a wonderful thing for archaeologists, right? Because water mixed with any organic material causes it to decompose. When there's no water, when you have these desiccated environments, things are preserved, even wood, even very fragile organic materials, even linen, even papyri, right? Papyruses. So we have this very dry environment. It's a desert, which makes it impossible to survive except for the Nile. And the Nile, fortunately, floods and creates these arable tracts on either side of the Nile. And this is what you see shown in green. And at the end of the river, at the northernmost edge, furthest downriver, you have this fan, which is the Nile Delta, where you have all of this sort of swampy but arable land for various sorts of crops. So people lived within close proximity to the Nile. Still do, but particularly in antiquity. The other really important thing to know, because this relates to sort of Egyptian religion in general, is the Nile floods, and it floods for very particular reasons, because that tributary, the Blue Nile, really floods down in Ethiopia, and all that water pushes up. But it floods predictably between May and August every year. Lots and lots of rain, and that water pushes up, which means you would have these huge floods that were on this rhythm. So imagine you don't know anything about modern science. You live in this dry, desiccated environment, and your life is predicated off of these semi-annual cycles of death and rebirth of vegetation and of the animals that can live off of that vegetation. Explains an awful lot about sort of Egyptian cosmology as we get into ideas of resurrection, ideas of cyclicality, ideas of sort of ebb and flow. Okay, so just bear that in mind. Everything, just like our eclectic ecology exhibition, culture is a function of geography and ecology in so many ways. So this is what we mean by ancient Egypt. We mean ranging from 3000 BC to AD 642. Along the Nile Delta, along the Nile, particularly north of Memphis, but sort of along the Nile, flowing all the way down into sort of modern-day Sudan, what was called in that period Nubia. I will just say one thing about dates, right? Because there is some conversation, which is frequently had, about AD BC versus BCE CE. So the way I like to think of this is whatever your date, imagine you lived in 3 BC, how terrified you would have been that the numbers were going down. It doesn't matter your nomenclature, right? When the original date was BC AD, right? We're still oriented around that pivotal year in human history. So the convention that I use as a scholar of early Christianity is BC AD, because no matter what your terminology is, you're using the same date range. It would be inappropriate if you were using, say, an Islamic calendar, right? You would use AH. So I think since we're working around the same dates, that's my preference as a scholar of early Christianity and Byzantium, but it is a matter of preference and no offense is meant. Okay? The point is, imagine how terrifying it would have been. I would be. I don't get credit for that, right? This is being filmed. I want you to know I can't remember the comedian's name, but some comedian made that joke. So I want to be a little bit more precise about what we mean by ancient Egypt before we get to look at some pretty pictures. I know an art historian comes up here and he just shows you text. What's that about? Ancient Egypt is periodized. It's a fancy word for broken into chunks. And archaeologists and art historians pretend to be super sophisticated, but basically all we do is break things into threes, right? That's all we do. So ancient Egypt can more or less be broken into an old kingdom, a middle kingdom, and a new kingdom. We're also shockingly original in the way that we name things. And everything before the old kingdom is called early dynastic. Well, it's not true. There's early dynastic, there's pre-dynastic, and then there's Neolithic. But early dynastic is really where we start caring about ancient Egypt, because it is in those early dynasties, dynasties 0, 1, and 2, with names that some of you may remember from art history, like Narmer and his palette, that Upper and Lower Egypt are unified. Right? And that unification carries with it some really important implications for the way society is structured, the way that goods are purveyed, and the way that writing emerges to start cataloging various elements of that more centralized lifestyle. That is followed by the Old Kingdom. Old Kingdom, think Sphinx, right? Think pyramids, right? We'll see an example of a sculpture of Khafre, who built one of the pyramids at Giza, in subsequent slides. The Old Kingdom is then followed by the Middle Kingdom. Middle Kingdom, the most powerful dynasty is Dynasty 12, but a lot of people sort of look over the Middle Kingdom, frankly. There's some remarkable things that go on, but they kind of skip straight to the New Kingdom because that's Ramses. And everyone here remembers the Ramses show, but also, of course, Ramses makes an appearance here or there in the Bible. So a lot of people focus on the Old Kingdom, big pyramids, and and indeed in the show, Middle Kingdom is sort of least represented. So the slide demonstrating the Middle Kingdom I'll show you is actually from an image from the Met, not from the Brooklyn Museum. And then after the New Kingdom, you have this conglomeration of periods, which I'm just calling for you, the late through the Roman periods. But there are moments here where the Persian Empire rules Egypt. There are moments here where the Hellenistic Empire rules Egypt. It's kind of a fray of external empires coming in, and it sort of settles out with that Arab conquest that culminates in 646, but really sort of Egypt falls in 642. Now, for those of you who are either incredibly hawk-eyed or just always looking for me to make a mistake now that I've announced my departure, you will notice that there are some several hundred-year gaps up here. And that is because, again, in our spectacularly inventive and intelligent way, we have decided as art historians and archaeologists to identify, count them, 3 intermediate periods. That's literally what we call them, very sophisticated. So between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, there is the first intermediate period. Guess what we call the period between the Middle and the New Kingdom? Intermediate. Great, you get the point, right? So the first and the third intermediate periods are about a fracturing of power. So whereas in the pre-dynastic period, Upper and Lower Egypt are unified, in the first and third intermediate period, it fractures into all of these different warring entities. The second intermediate period is a little bit different. An invading peoples called the Hyksos, but probably the Hittites, come in from the Middle East and set up shop for a little while before ultimately being repelled and power really restored in the 18th dynasty, as we'll discuss in just a few slides. So this gives you the basic lay of the land, right, at a slightly more granular level, but we'll come back to this idea of Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, and indeed the Roman period. So I'm going to actually read these because I know the further away you get, the harder it will be. But what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to give you a sense for how ancient Egyptians were concerned with and thought about iconoclasm. So what it says is, and I quote, and this is a translation by Robert Rittner, which is included in the catalog for this show, in an article by the curator from Brooklyn named Ed Bleiberg. So what this says is, quote, "As for anyone in this entire land who may do an injurious or evil thing to your statues, offering slabs, chapels, woodwork, or monuments which are in any temple precincts or in any temples, my majesty does not permit that their property nor that of their fathers remain with them, nor that they join the spirits in the necropolis, nor that they remain among the living." Translation, if you mess up my statue, then you won't get any property from your fathers, you won't join the afterworlds, and you're going to die. Strong words. Dating to around 2000 BC. And then again, just sort of gesturally, to show you something from 500 to 700 years later, another quote, another inscription that you would find near statues. "As for anyone who will attack my corpse in the necropolis, who will remove my statue from my tomb, Ra, the sun deity, hates him. He shall have no water from the altar of Osiris. He shall not transmit his property to his children forever." You think we care about property? I mean, this is serious stuff. So the point here is just gesturally to show, there are different ways that you could look at primary sources as a historian. But usually, if someone is saying, "Don't ruin my statues," it means that there's a problem with people ruining their statues, right? The presence of these types of inscriptions is indicative of the presence of a behavior. So we can see, over a span of 1,000 years, and this is one of the things about Egypt that we observe as people in the 21st century with great admiration, you see millennia of continuity in style, in imagery and iconography, and also in certain practices. Okay? So iconoclasm is something you see across Egyptian history, and these quotes illustrate that. The other thing, though, that I do want to point your attention to is this interesting correspondence between body and image in ancient Egypt. We'll come back to this. But note that the penalty, right, is the same whether you attack someone's corpse or you attack their statue. That's something we're going to come back to, this notion of the similarity and the difference or not between the actual human being and the image itself. So to that end, why destroy images in the first place? This is a statue of Ptah, right, who is a deity in the Egyptian pantheon. And some of you may be broadly familiar with Egyptian mythology. It's complicated because there are lots of different texts, and it's unclear which text is a copy of earlier texts. And as anyone here can relate to, right, you may be a religion, but there are lots of different types of that religion. So simply because you lived in ancient Egypt doesn't necessarily believe you had exactly the same belief sets. And indeed, those cities along the Nile, many of them would have had slightly different belief sets because they would have privileged slightly different deities. But in the broad scheme of things, there are two gods who are usually associated with creation in Egyptian religion and Egyptian cosmology. One of them is Atun, right, who we're not going to talk about too much, and the other is Ptah. Because Ptah is viewed as the person who is both the god of creation, but also the god of craftsmen, the god who helps people make things. And indeed, you see this reflected in texts dating from, and the statue here dates from 1000 BC, from that third intermediate period. But the quotes here date arguably from sort of Middle Kingdom, early New Kingdom, all the way through to the 25th dynasty. But just to read these two quotes to you, Ptah is the very great who gives life to all the gods and their cause. So this is the idea of Ptah as the creator. He gives life to all of the gods and their cause. What's that funny word? That is sort of like the idea of a spirit or a soul, more like a life force in ancient Egypt. So this belief that Ptah didn't just create the gods, but he gave them life in his creation. And then the second quote from the Book of the Dead, which is something people generally know about, but it comes from a particular spell, a particular ritual in the Book of the Dead called the opening of the mouth ceremony. Right? So I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to tell you what the opening of the mouth ceremony is. My mouth is given to me. My mouth is opened by Ptah with that chisel of metal with which he opened the mouth of the gods. So this idea, again, of Ptah as creator, right? He has created the gods, right? But he also opens the mouth of the dead. So the idea in ancient Egyptian religion, and this is why corpses had to be mummified and why offerings were so important in their funerary rituals, ancient Egyptians had a very complicated idea of what animates us, right? When you look at a corpse, there is clearly something missing from someone who is living. It's not animated. And in ancient Egypt, there were multiple different ideas about what animated. There's a ka, there's a ba. They don't all rhyme with ah. But there are lots of different parts to what they would consider, what we would call the soul. But there was a belief that some of those parts were sustained through food, not just the body. Some of that force was sustained through food. So in order for Egyptians in the afterlife to remain sustained, they had to have their mouth opened so they could continue to eat and drink. And that is why there were constantly food and drink being put out daily for individuals. It was a very expensive enterprise to die in ancient Egypt, right? And they come up with all sorts of funerary rituals to provide themselves with sustenance in and for the afterlife. But what's key for us is that there is this notion of a deity who literally creates images, creates likenesses, craftsmen, right, who also creates and animates deities. This shows up in other parts of ancient Egyptian religion. There is a deity named Khnum, who is literally the god of the Nile, right? But the way that Egyptians believed you were born was since the Nile floods, and it gives life, as we've already discussed. The silt of the Nile flood, which was considered life-giving after all, because without it people wouldn't survive, was put on Khnum's potter's wheel. And he would make little babies out of that silt and put them in his mother's belly. So you can see, there are many myths besides, but you can see that there's this idea in ancient Egypt that images are alive, and that images are made by craftspeople who are imbued by their patron deity with the power to animate with life force. This is the basis for a fundamental Egyptian religious belief, which is different than anything that we can conceive today. They literally believe that their statues were alive. Literally. You have to imagine that a statue of Hatshepsut, a sculpture of Hatshepsut, sorry, I clearly need a drink of water. That's a lot of shisses. Was literally alive. She was watching you. She needed to be fed, right? She needed to have food and drink given to her. She was not just present in the sculpture, it was her. It was animated with these same life forces, which is why they were treated that way. So what would you expect when the images are destroyed? You would expect people to want to kill them. That was the way to remove their power. So here you see an Old Kingdom example of iconoclasm. This is in the show. You can see that we call it a statue of a family group, but then in parentheses it says Urkapta, again, and family. We say question mark because it looks an awful lot like another statue that we have of Urkapta, but we don't know that they were found in exactly the same location. So here you see sort of an archetypal Egyptian man, sort of foot astride, flanked by a woman, his wife at his left foot, and his son behind him. His wife was not really that small, but this is what we call hieratic perspective typically. So basically the important figure, the individual Urkapta, was shown large, and his family flanking him. And you can see here that his nose is destroyed. Now there are two important things to know about this. So the first is notice that his wife and son are not damaged at all. So there was no fear from this person, who was probably a tomb robber. He was a supervisor of the granary, which would have been a very important job. There was no fear of retribution from the wife or the son who were accompanying Urkapta, but whose tomb it was not. There was a fear, though, that this grave robber might be attacked by Urkapta, who was alive. So in order to kill him, he gouged out his nose so he could not breathe. Okay? So literally, the destruction exists to kill the image, because the image is viewed as being alive. In another example, Middle Kingdom iconoclasm, you can see exactly the same strategy is used here. So we're not going to belabor the method of destruction so much, just to say that it's a rather remarkable portrait of, you can pronounce his name a bunch of different ways, but actually, in spite of how it looks, I pronounce it, and most people do, I think, is Senwosret. Who is a very powerful ruler of the 12th dynasty, and his progeny went on to long rules as well. This was probably destroyed at the fall of the 12th dynasty, which would bring us into the second intermediate period at the close of the Middle Kingdom. But here, unlike our first example, where you have this idealized form, right? This individual with sort of this incredibly strong body, and actually not a really anatomically correct pose. You see these sort of hollowed out, puffy eyes. You have a sense of age. There's more portraiture, more quality of portraiture here. There's a little bit more realism, and this is characteristic of Senwosret's sculptures, and shows that some of these iconographical, some of these stylistic choices that artists made were just those. They were choices, right? This idea that ancient Egyptians weren't capable of the same levels of realism as later sculptors isn't quite borne out by the material evidence, even though the trend is obviously stiff, more rigid. But something like this shows real dynamism and liveliness. So I thought it was important to include this. It also shows sort of the trans-historical phenomenon of iconoclasm laid bare. Here you have an image of Ahmose, who's the mother of Hatshepsut. So this is arguably one of the first examples of the Immaculate Conception that gets recorded in history. So Hatshepsut, for all sorts of reasons which are beyond the scope of this conversation, wanted very much to legitimize her power. So she developed a narrative whereby her mother, Ahmose, was impregnated by the god Ra, who came to her in the form of Thutmose I, her father, right? But it was actually the deity, right, who impregnated her. So she was a direct descendant, Hatshepsut, from Ra. Okay? And this is an example of the destruction of her mother's image, probably the destruction of something which would have lined some sort of temple complex. And the reason that Hatshepsut's mother would have been destroyed, as well as Hatshepsut's earlier image, is because Hatshepsut became pharaoh as a consequence of her husband, Thutmose II's death. She co-ruled with Thutmose III, who was her son and her stepson. She was not the mother of Thutmose III. So as soon as Thutmose could get the crown for himself, it became not very expedient for him to be associated with this woman from whom he didn't derive any of his legitimacy. And that's why images associated with Hatshepsut and her successors, her family, were ultimately destroyed. And then just to show that this phenomenon continues into the Roman period, although in a somewhat different way, here's a 1st century AD or BC, right? It gets a little bit difficult to date, but probably 1st century AD image of Isis, the Egyptian deity originally, the wife of Osiris, but who becomes the most popular deity in the Roman Empire, interestingly, in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. This destruction would probably have been done in the early Christian period by Christians who were responding very much like the Islamic State in Mosul to the idea of the image as being something which was just pagan rather than the actual meaning of the image itself, because Isis becomes the basis for a very important part of Christian iconography, namely, she nurses Horus in exactly the same pose that the Madonna and Child ends up assuming just a few centuries after the sculpture is made. So iconoclasm continues in Egypt throughout the period in which we're looking at. Iconoclasm really is this trans-historical phenomenon, not just because I say so, not just because of the quotes, but because you see it in the material evidence. So I'm just going to throw a few things out before we wind down here, hopefully with a little bit of time for Q&A. There are a few other things about Egyptian art which are notable, which are particularly relevant as we think about this concept of iconoclasm and the meanings that it has for us today, the relevance that it has for us today. So the first is to note that the iconography, the imagery that is used and associated with particular gods, because of course people die, rulers die, but the gods more or less persist. That imagery associated with the gods is remarkably consistent. It changes, right? There are gods that sometimes are shown with an ibis head and sometimes shown as a baboon, same god. There's a god that sort of starts off as a lion and becomes a hippopotamus. That's a complicated one. Yeah, plastic surgeons made a lot of money in ancient Egypt. So there are these changes that one sees over the history of ancient Egyptian imagery, but there's a remarkable consistency. Here is a sculpture of Khafre, right, pyramid, and he is being embraced by, right, shielded by, generating his power from Horus. Now it's worth one slight digression here. Horus was the son, right, of Isis and Osiris. Now for those of you who don't know, that was sort of a magical conception because what happened was Osiris was cut up into very small pieces. Isis found them all, put them back together just long enough for them to have Horus. It's a remarkable story. But the reason I bring that up is because this idea of dismembering bodies into small pieces is also relevant to our conversation about iconoclasm, right? If an image and the person are one and the same, then the way that you can remove power isn't just by killing, but is literally by breaking apart. So right in the foundational myth of ancient Egypt or of Egyptian cosmology, you see this idea of iconoclasm in a weird way playing itself out. So over here, we have an image of Horus from 2750 BC. And over here, you have an image from the Ptolemaic period, which is a fancy name for saying, the Hellenistic Empire in Egypt, the Greek Empire in Egypt. And it probably dates here to the 3rd century BC. But over 2,400 years, Horus is still a falcon, right? Now, that's a really important point. It's a really important point as we think about how images mean. Now, it may seem ridiculous to us today that there is a god who is a falcon. That's not what's relevant, right? And if there is a Horus, he's really angry at me right now. What is relevant, though, is that there was a belief that images of Horus must look a certain way. It's back to this idea of what is an icon, that likeness, that similitude, that consistency in imagery matters. The way that an image becomes an image of Horus is that it looks like a falcon. So part of the way that it gets its power is by looking like a falcon. You couldn't create an image of a clicker and call it Horus and call it a dangerous icon very well, right? So part of the power of images resides in its affinity to some archetype, resides in the way that it is visually associated with something we all agree is a symbol of that thing, right? So to put it simply, the more an image looks like the thing we all expect it to look like, the more powerful that image is. Right? That's sort of an important point. Yeah, try saying that in like 30 seconds on a news channel, right? It's not that easy. But there is another way that images can mean. And I would be remiss if I went through an entire lecture on ancient Egypt and didn't talk at all about Akhenaten. Everyone's so interested in Akhenaten, and for good reason. So Akhenaten was a pharaoh who arguably created the first monotheistic religion. I mean, that's not really quite true. The other deities sort of existed, but they were subordinated to this new deity, the Aten, the sun disk, right? And he set up a new capital at Amarna, Tel El Amarna, which was further upriver, therefore further south. Yes, I know, we're still wrapping our minds around that. And this is a relief that would have lined one of the temple complexes there, and probably actually was reused after, this was a bad experiment that did not work out well. We pivoted back to the traditional ancient Egyptian deities rather quickly. And after this experiment failed, a pharaoh named Horemheb destroyed the complex and actually used some of the material to build new buildings. But before he did, he made sure to ritually destroy the images in very particular ways. Here you see Akhenaten himself, an 18th dynasty pharaoh, New Kingdom pharaoh, whose face has been totally destroyed, right? Including, as we now know, his nose, so he can no longer breathe. The sun disk, which would have been up here, to which he was making, Akhenaten was making this gift, right? This offering has been destroyed as well. So there's no trace of Akhenaten, there's no trace of Aten. But of course, Akhenaten has given himself the name Akhenaten. So Aten appears, the name Aten appears in his name. So you can see on his arm, there are these pits. And unfortunately, you can't see it in this image, but that's where his name was written and surrounded by what are called cartouches. And those have been gouged out. So the name Aten has literally been destroyed. And back here, this pitting is the ritual destruction of more text that describes the scene we're looking at. And of course, this lovely little lady with her the girl with her flower has not been touched at all. Just like we saw in Urukapta, where the wife and the son weren't touched, but the nose was gouged out of the individual that people feared. So here, all of the power of Aten has been removed, but it hasn't just been removed through the imagery, it's been removed through the text. And this is another really important point, which is sometimes when we don't have a shared meaning about what something is supposed to look like, it can take on that meaning with just a caption, with just a description. If you don't know that Horus is supposed to be a falcon, but you just know that there's some god named Horus, now all of a sudden, if you see something that has a clicker and it's called Horus, you might start thinking that this is Horus. But we generally know that Horus is a falcon. Here, partly because the religion hadn't taken such great hold, right? And also partly because there was real fear of the word as image, the words themselves, the hieroglyphs, were destroyed. And we'll talk more about this phenomenon of word as image. But when you go home or when you're reading something, I would ask you to consider if you're actually reading it. You're not, right? You're not sounding out the syllables. You're responding to the letter combination as an image. Words are images. And that's not just because we're talking about Egyptian hieroglyphs, which are pictograms, okay? So to summarize, what are our big takeaways so far as we head towards the close and towards our final lecture? First is that iconoclasm takes several forms in ancient Egypt, but it's a consistent practice. You've seen it demonstrated in the archaeological and the textual evidence. The second is that images in ancient Egypt derive their power from a cosmology that literally imagines sculptures as living. This is very different from our own, but you should start to see shades of similarity with the ways we think about images, and in particular, the relationship between images and likeness. And third and finally, sculptures are individually identifiable based on some combination of likeness and inscription. Right? So these are the three big lessons I want you all taking away from you. And just because I promised you that we would start thinking about application, but we won't fully engage it tonight, I want you to think about this in relation to hemming. And I want you to think about it in terms of a sculpture that does not show an individual Confederate soldier, but shows a generalized Confederate soldier. I want you to think about what it means that that soldier is identified with an inscription, JLI, Jacksonville Light Infantry. I want you to think about how it is this contested space and this contested sculpture becomes contested, not through our shared history, but through a theory of images, of likeness, and of the relationship between likeness and text that we're starting to uncover through our ancient Egyptian analogies. There aren't answers, right? There are just some more questions. And then at the end, in our design shred, hopefully we'll be able to have a civil conversation about what those lessons mean for how we should think about contested spaces like this one. Thank you for being with me. Thank you for your attention. There are very few drowsing eyes, which I appreciate. And with that, even though we are at the tail end of the lecture, I think I'll take let's take, by show of hands, who has questions? All right, good. There's only one in the back, so we'll take the one question, and then we'll release you into the night. Thank you all so much for being here. And one last question, one question in the back. So if we could bring the mic, you can yell it. I'll repeat it.
On the statues of the gods,
yes.
They do the same thing to the gods?
Yeah, good question. So the question was, with statues of the gods, could they do the same thing? There are two different parts to that answer. So the first is, yes, sort of, because pharaohs were considered gods. So obviously when you see a pharaonic sculpture which has been broken, there's some degree of disrespect being shown to gods. And then again, you saw another example of religious iconoclasm, explicitly religious iconoclasm targeted towards a deity, in that relief that showed the Aten sun disk being destroyed. But broadly speaking, if it is a god who is a key part of the pantheon, then you're not going to find very much evidence of destruction unless it is by another religious group, like the early Christian destruction of that image of Isis. That wouldn't have been done by someone who authentically believed that Isis was a deity, an important deity. A follow-up question from the same individual, yeah.
Was there any restriction on who could be made a statue, or that was what typically goes on? So like if my neighbor, could he just go and put a statue and it would have the effect because we want to take off his name?
So that's a great question. So the question was, could anyone put up a statue?
About themselves.
About themselves. The way that most art historians would answer that is in some tone that conveys absolute certainty. What I tend to believe is that humans were humans, which is actually the underlying premise of the whole lecture series. Right? If you can learn from history, then humans have been humans. So the question becomes, did you have the resources to produce a sculpture? And if you did have the resources to produce a sculpture, then you were probably in some post of sufficient importance to warrant having a sculpture made. Most of those sculptures that you're imagining that your neighbor would have made would have ended up in tombs, like your cop does, but publicly displayed sculptures, likely not. But that has to do with who owned what and who had access to those resources. So certainly, there would have been people who would have loved to have sculptures of themselves made, but given the distribution of resources, we don't see a ton of those in the archaeological evidence. So, all right, one more, and then I will be available to anyone who has any questions afterwards. So last question.
So in the image behind you, if Patmos were ordering that this image be destroyed, who would be the people to actually go and do it? Are they the same people that originally sculpted it, or was there a task force for that? Do we know?
Great question. So the question was, who actually destroyed the images? So the nature of the texts that come down to us is, first caveat, right? I am in fact a Romanist, not an Egyptian scholar. So I'll plead a little bit of I don't know at that level of detail. But the nature of the texts that come down to us are, there's selection bias in what's preserved, right? So the earliest texts we have are called the pyramid texts. Back to our archaeological innovation and naming. Those are texts that are on the inside of pyramids. So who had access to the inside of pyramids? Well, royal family. So that's not exactly representative of day-to-day iconoclastic practice. That gives us insight into sort of religious doctrine and belief, right? As you matriculate later and you have more papyri that are preserved, you get a better idea of some of daily life, but nothing like that is recorded, I would think, until you end up with sort of Greek historians like Herodotus giving accounts of what happens in Egypt. And I think Herodotus probably doesn't say very much about how it's carried out. But if you're a ruler, wherever you're a ruler, you have all sorts of people available to you. And depending on what you are promising the people who will follow you, it becomes very easy to mobilize a mass. And as we talk about early Christian and Byzantine iconoclasm, you'll see we have better primary source evidence, so we're a little bit able to see how you can foment sort of mass mentality. So that would be my guess, and I don't think the nature of the evidence permits us to say all that much more, but I plead a little bit of ignorance since I don't know it. It's not my deep expertise. So I'm going to be available for any other questions that people have, and we'll let everyone get on with their evening. Thank you so much for being here. Hope to see you at the next one.